Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, your guide to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, where you get to the PMP with our MP3. I am your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. The PMP exam is primarily an experience-based exam. Granted, while you will find some questions on the exam that will test your general project management knowledge and memory, most of the questions will be situational. On these questions, you will have to apply your experience to the question while remaining within the PMBOK framework in order to find the correct answer. In this lesson here, we look at how the concept of earned value that you find in the PMBOK Guide applies to real-world projects. Well, let's take a look at one of your projects. Do you know how it's doing? Are you currently within budget and within schedule? Do you know what your cost performance index or your schedule performance index is? Well, if your answer is yes, then you are probably using earned value techniques on your project. You can find the EV formulas to calculate these numbers in the PMBOK Guide. But what good are formulas if you really don't know what earned value really does on your project? This is what we look at in this lesson with our guest, Quentin Fleming. And you might say that Quentin has written the book on earned value. In fact, the book he wrote is simply called Earned Value Project Management. And I was just absolutely amazed about his deep understanding on this topic and the benefits that it brings to project management. So please join us as we delve into earned value with one of the top names in the field. This discussion will give you the background that you need in order to understand what all those earned value formulas are really trying to say. Let's hear a little bit about our guest, and then we'll go right into the interview. Quentin Fleming is an author, instructor, and consultant to management with over 3 decades of project management experience within private industries. He has a particular expertise in the design and the assessment of project management control systems. He is the author of 8 published textbooks that have covered the varied subjects of earned value project management, planning and scheduling, or procurement management. He has been an instructor with the University of California, Irvine Extension since 1995, and he served as the PMI Orange County chapter president in 1998. And during the years 1999 and 2000, he was one of the 8-person core team which updated the PMBOK Guide for the Project Management Institute. Same thing again, by the way, in 2008, and he is also mentioned as a contributor to the PMBOK Guide 5th edition in 2012. He worked on several chapters in the guide and was, of course, responsible for the earned value inputs into Chapter 4. Hello, Quentin, and welcome to the program. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Today, we want to discuss simple earned value. And I learned about this by reading an article that you had written together with Joel Kopelman. And the article was titled, Start with Simple Earned Value on All Your Projects. Before we get into that, though, why don't you give us an overview over earned value, what it is, what its benefits are, and why we have it?
Okay, let me start with a definition that we put in PMBOK 2, Issue 2, which was issued in year 2000, and it was repeated in the 2004 version, almost verbatim. Earned value is a project management methodology to do 2 things: to integrate the project baseline and to accurately measure performance against that baseline. By an integrated baseline, we're talking about integrating scope with the required resources to accomplish that scope locked into a time frame with a schedule. We achieve this with use of defining the project with a work breakdown structure. We define the total project, we decompose it, and at the very lowest WBS element, we integrate scope with the required resources locked into a time frame. That's an integrated baseline. That's the project baseline against we measure our performance. Secondly, we accurately measure performance against that baseline. We focus on what we call, quote, the earned value, unquote. Earned value consists of two things. It consists of the authorized work tasks which have been completed, plus the management's budget to accomplish that work. I'd like to make a point here. It does not include actual costs. Whatever we spent is a different issue. Earned value, the thing that we're tracking, and you could call it percentage complete, is the authorized work which we have completed and management's budget for that work.
Of course, following this definition, we have to mention your book because you have written almost the book on earned value. It's called Earned Value Management. It's currently in the 3rd edition.
Earned Value Project Management.
Earned Value Project Management. Sorry.
To differentiate from Earned Value Management.
Right.
And we did that. We intentionally inserted project management in there to emphasize the point that earned value is for projects. It is not for continuous business processes.
Absolutely makes sense. So Earned Value Project Management, it's currently in its 3rd edition and available everywhere, right?
Available primarily from the Project Management Institute.
The PMI bookstore.
PMI bookstore.
All right. I'll make sure that I have a link to the PMI bookstore so that people can purchase that book through there. Why and when did Joel and you decide to write something about a simplified version of earned value? When did you realize it's time to move into that?
Because for years, and I'm not saying anything derogatory about the Department of Defense, but there is a tendency on the part of federal agencies to overcomplicate things. And I learned this 25 years ago. When I had a stack of documents a foot high and I couldn't discern what they were trying to tell me. So I've been affiliated with Joel Koppelman for about 13 years now. And Joel is of the belief, and the first time I met him, he said, earned value is a great concept. We ought to apply it to all projects. Agreed. Secondly, he said, but earned value is part of the Department of Defense's cost, schedule, control systems criteria is overcomplicated. There's too many formal regulations. He said, we've got to find a way to simplify this. He brought me on board in 1993, and for the purpose of doing missionary work, to taking earned value, breaking it down into its fundamentals, and employing it on all projects. And I think we've been very successful. We started out with a series of articles for PM Network, and after we had written about the 5th or 6th article, it occurred to me that we had the makings of a book. Because, one article would be how to define your project, how to plan and schedule, how to estimate the resources, and so forth. And so it occurred to us that we had the makings of a book. So in 1996, I contacted PMI. They said they'd be very interested, and we signed a contract. And the first issue came out at the PMI conference in Boston in 1996. 4 years later, they asked us to update. 4 years later, they asked us to update it again.
Now, this is the Earned Value Project Management book, right?
Yes.
So how did you then move from that to the simple version, the article that I read about?
The Earned Value Project Management book takes the more formal government approach,
right,
and it defines it down into the fundamentals. You have to start by defining your project. Mm-hmm. You have to plan it, schedule it. You have to estimate the resources. You have to pick points of management control.
How was it received, this somewhat simplified version?
Extremely well.
Extremely well?
Yeah. The fact that we've taken a dull textbook and have updated it twice is an indication that it's doing well.
I assume, however, that the government is still using the full-blown earned value with all its, how many is it, 32 criteria?
It was 35. When it began, it was 35. Now it's 32.
Right.
32 is still a big number. When you can start the process, you can start the process of complying with the government requirement by simply focusing on 10 of the 32 criteria. And in the article that you mentioned,
yes,
which is in Crosstalk, which is on my website, we define these 10, we call them 10 steps.
Right.
And we make reference to a specific earned value management system, or ANSI standard 740.
748.
748. I should know that because I worked on it. I reviewed it before it went in. We make reference to 10 of the 32 ANSI standard 748. It's our belief, it's our recommendation that projects that have to comply with ANSI standard 748, they should begin by taking these 10 steps. That will get the project manager, their executive management, the customer, all oriented on earned value performance on the projects.
In the article, when I read through these first 3 steps, they are, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. 1, you must define the scope of the project. 2, you must determine who will perform the defined work. And number 3, you must plan and schedule the defined work. Now, to me, this looks like plain project management. That doesn't sound like earned value.
It's fundamentals.
Right.
Why should you deviate?
Yes.
We should do this on all of our projects. Question, do we?
Well, yeah, that would have been my next question. How many folks actually do this?
Well, I can't answer for the world, but a lot of projects start out by not defining what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm as guilty as anyone else.
Sure, they start out, and then they don't take the second step of figuring out who's going to do the work, including do we have the resources available within our company, or are we going to have to outsource some of this work, and then planning and scheduling the work. Pretty fundamental stuff.
Why do you think that is, that most of us fail in step 1, which says you must define the scope of the project?
Defining the scope of the project is criterion number 1. It always has been. When the Air Force came up with the criteria, initially it was called CSPEC in 1965. Criterion number 1 said, thou must define the work to be done. A lot of projects, and I don't want to mention any names, but we know who they are convinced that their activities are unique. We are so different from the rest of the world that we don't have to define it, or we can't define it. And they've got themselves convinced. And management lets them get away with it. And that's unfortunate.
Tighter management control, maybe?
Well, I don't know if it's tighter management control. It's insisting on the basics. Define the work before you start. Determine who's going to perform it, plan and schedule it, estimate the resources, authorize budgets, define the metrics to measure performance. That's fundamental stuff.
Right, right.
We ought to be doing it on all of our projects.
Okay. So the first 3 you've already looked at. Let's look at the other ones that you have here. You've already mentioned a couple of them. Number 4, you must estimate the required resources and formally authorize budgets. Now, I've often noticed on my own projects, I don't even get a budget. I'm just being given something and said, here, do this. Yes, I see you cringe.
I find it incredible, but true. A lot of projects float down the stream and they don't have a designated project manager. People ask, who's the project manager? And somebody will say, well, I guess I am. That's unfortunate. Every project ought to have a project manager that you can promote when things go well.
Yes, or let go or blame if things don't go well.
Hold accountable. And so when I talk about, and I broke it that number 4, estimate the resources and formally authorize the budgets. There's a difference between an estimate, which is often what people would like to have, and a budget, which is the formal authorization of what management can afford. And oftentimes they're different. We should be working not to our estimate, but to the formal authorized budget.
Well, if like in my case, you don't have a budget,
then you work to anything you want.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't define what you're going to do and you're not given a budget, you're not given a schedule, you don't know who the project manager is, what do you call that? Some might suggest it's chaos.
Yeah, it is. Let's look at the next one, number 5.
Number 5 is define the metrics to measure performance. How are you going to measure performance? And we rely typically on the scheduling system to measure performance. Are we going to measure completion of milestones? Are we going to do percent complete estimates? Are we going to take a task and break it into 2 pieces, 50% when we start and 50% when we legitimately complete it? Those are the metrics we should define in our project management plan before we begin work.
I always find defining metrics for my project very difficult.
Absolutely.
Coming up with a metric that makes sense, that I can measure at the end, that I can actually follow throughout the project. What is one to do?
It's best to have the people who are performing the work, the technical people who are responsible for the performance of the work, define how am I going to be measured? How best can I be measured? Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with taking a task and spreading it over 2 or 3 months and saying, this, I'm going to use a task manager's subjective estimate as the percentage complete for that work. Now you can put some objectivity into it and define for perhaps a deliverable at the end of each month. And I don't move into month 2 until I've finished the deliverable for month 1. And that method is probably my favorite method. I like to take a task, stretch it out, as long as it's homogeneous work, same work, and break it and get a responsible engineer's estimate the percent complete.
In particular, if you ask them in advance and tell them, how do you want me to measure you? It was their idea. You get their buy-in.
And particularly if they set up deliverables. At the end of 30 days, I have the following deliverables, which is worth 30% of the total budget. At the end of month 2, I have an additional deliverable, which is worth another 30%, yes. So forth. That works extremely well. It works on all projects, even software.
Step number 6.
Let me get it. Let me define number 6. Right. Determine points of management control. Points of management control. If it's a small project, and I'm assuming that the project manager has no staff. It's just the project manager herself managing the project with no staff, which means that the person has to define the work, authorize a budget, and issue it to somebody else, to a functional organization to perform. That person performs on behalf of the project. That's called matrix management. I've just described matrix management, which is the way we manage most of the projects. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with it. Matrix management works great. But if the project's $50,000 over a 2-month period or 3-month period, the project manager can manage everything. But supposing it grows to $500,000, that's probably more people than the project manager can manage. So the project manager will typically break it into what we call CAPS, C-A-P-S, CAPS, which is defined in the PMBOK as a point of management control. It's a sub-project. So the project manager doesn't manage everything. The project manager manages sub-projects. So number 6 is determine points of management control and establish a baseline.
How do you define these points of control?
That's why project managers make such excessively high salaries, because only they can determine it. But I've gone into organizations where they'll have maybe 10 points of control, and then I'll come back 6 months later and they've either reduced it to 5 or they've increased it to 15, because they figure that their span of control wasn't right. They weren't getting the feedback that they need. So they'll divide it into, they'll take the same budget, the same work, whether they have 10 or 5 or 15 doesn't change the work to be done. It merely bundles it into different packages, different sub-projects. And how do they determine it? It's based on experience. And oftentimes they'll start off with 10 and they'll go to 12. Or subsequently they'll go to 14.
Let me step outside of earned value here quickly, and let's talk about company culture, corporate culture, because when we're talking about these control points, we're talking about measuring our employees. Does that lead to an organizational culture of control, of oversight?
Yes.
What can I do?
It's not only measuring employees and points of management control, which we call CAPs or teams or sub-projects. It's managing the project itself. And there are executives overseeing the performance of the project. Sometimes executives may not want to be able to predict the final cost.
Yes.
And yet executive management want to be able to predict. The worst thing that executives can do is to authorize 10 projects and have them all overrun by 100%.
Yeah, that would
in
be
which
bad.
case they've got a disastrous performance. So earned value does run into a wall because it does allow everybody to be on the same page. The project manager, the project management team, functional management, executive management, the customer, they should all be reviewing the same data. They should all know what is the cost performance and schedule performance of a given project. And if it isn't good, they can then drill down to where the problems are.
So what kind of processes do I need to put in place as an organization to measure, to control, and also to make adjustments?
You need a process defined in a procedure. Well, first of all, you need a policy statement that says that our organization is going to use a form of earned value management to report progress of all of our projects. So you need a policy statement. Then you need a procedure which captures the process. And I would suggest that you could copy these 10 steps that I'm going to be describing to start the process. That is a minimal but adequate, robust form of earned value. It will give you earned value adequate to measure performance on your projects. And then if the organization encounters this ANSI standard 748, they can easily expand it to meet the needs of their customer.
All right, let's move back to, we were at step 6. Let's move on to step 7. What have we got?
It's called record costs by projects. Now, what could be easier? Record costs by projects. I find I come out of the aerospace and defense industry, and we used to complain about our accounting system. It was a lousy accounting system. We can't do anything with it. But the one thing we could always do is tell our project managers how much they've spent and how much they've committed. We had a good accounting system. And we could break it down into sub-projects and sub-projects by task. So we really had a good accounting system. What I find as I'm a consultant going into organizations, I find that many organizations cannot do this. Many public agencies, many utilities, many state agencies, many federal agencies cannot tell their project managers how much money they've spent by project and by sub-project. Now, with utilities, they've been functionally oriented, functionally dominated for so long that they can tell how many engineering hours they've spent, but they can't tell how many engineering hours by project. Pretty fundamental. Point is, earned value is three-dimensional. What I plan to do, what I have done, and what I have spent. Three-dimensional. You've got to get that third dimension, because you want to relate. Earned value is an industrial engineering concept. Going back 100 years, we've got Frederick W. Taylor was really the father of earned value. And they related actual hours with earned standards to determine their cost performance. You've got to be able to do this. Item number 7 is record costs by project. You've got to be able to tell the project manager how much money they've spent.
Not just give them a lump sum of, we've spent so much for these 10 projects without being able to divide it up.
That's right. You tell the chief engineer how much money they've spent. That's wrong. You've got to be able to break it out by project and by sub-project within the project so that we can determine the cost performance.
What's number 8?
Number 8 is measure project performance. Now, I'm going down a list of 10. 8 of the 10, 1 through 7, and number 10, are steps that we ought to be taking on all projects, regardless of industry, regardless of size. We ought to be doing all these things. 8 and 9 are unique to earned value. So I've got to indicate that this is above and beyond what we normally do on most projects. Number 8 is measure project performance. Right out of the PMBOK, right out of PMBOK 2 and 3, it says that you've got to be able to discern a schedule variance. A schedule variance is earned value less planned value. Schedule variance is what we've accomplished less what we hope to accomplish. And if you take earned value and subtract planned value and come up with anything less than 1.0, you're behind your baseline schedule. Now, earned value tells you, with respect to a schedule variance, it tells you that you're falling behind your baseline plan. Realistically, the baseline plan may have had a lot of float. So you can't panic if you have a negative schedule variance. You've got to drill down and discern what is behind. And look for critical path tasks. Look for high-risk tasks. Okay. The second variance which is more serious and more important than the schedule variance, because I'm assuming we've got a scheduling system that's working. The second variance is the cost variance. That is earned value less actual costs. Earned value less the actual costs that we spent to move the plan into earned. So it's the earned value less what we've actually spent and or committed. We may not have recorded those costs, in which case we've got to estimate those costs. But it's the cost that we spent to convert plan value, the base plan, into the earnings. Let's take some numbers. We earn $100,000. The earned value is $100,000. The actual costs are $200,000. We take $100,000 less $200,000. We are $100,000 overrun. Why is that important? Because from my experience, overruns are non-recoverable. You don't recover them. People get irritated when I say that, and I say it all the time. They get irritated. What right do you have to say that we can't do better, we can't get more efficient, we can't recover it? Well, think about it. Your best planning is in the front end, your best schedule, your most achievable schedule, your best definition of the work, your best budget is in the front end. And if you overrun the front end, in order to recover that, you have to underrun the far end.
Yeah, the money's gone, the money's spent.
It's sunk costs.
Yes.
And it's hard to recover sunk costs. And why that's so important, if we take earned value of $100,000 and divide it, not subtract it, but divide it by actual cost of $200,000, we come up with a cost efficiency rate of 0.5. We can use that 0.5 to extrapolate the end. And that brings me to number 9. You forecast the estimates at completion. You use the earned value data, either the cost variance by itself, the overrun by itself, the cost efficiency by itself, or the cost efficiency in conjunction with the schedule efficiency. There's a number of different formulas. There's probably 17 different formulas. In my book, we recommend 3 to make it easy. We believe in a simplified form. We've cited 3 formulas, primarily focusing on the cost efficiency. If you've taken the front end and you've performed in the front end and you've achieved a cost efficiency of 0.5, in all likelihood, you're going to overrun that project by 100%. The Department of Defense has done an excellent job of empirically analyzing hundreds of projects, and their conclusions are that you can't recover the overrun in the front end, and that you're most likely to achieve your cost efficiency on the rest of the project. How accurate is that? If you're 20% through the project, 20% earned, and you've achieved a cost efficiency, you can use that cost efficiency to extrapolate the end, and you will be accurate within plus or minus 10%. That's reason alone to use earned value. If you're truly interested in finding out what the total project's going to cost.
What about doing the same for the schedule? Let's say I'm 20% into the project and I'm 20% behind schedule. Can I catch up?
You're focusing on an important point here. To me, the weakest part of earned value is the schedule portion of it. There's no substitute for critical path methodology. The critical path will determine when you're going to finish the project. If you can be behind on your earned value schedule variance, but if the behind work has lots of float, lots of positive float, it may not be important. What's more important is what your critical path is telling you. Because your critical path, if it's telling you a 10-month project is going to take 15 months, then you better focus your attention on shortening that critical path. You better shorten those tasks. You better provide redundancy, whatever, crash the network, add resources. Now, when you add resources, your cost variance goes down the tubes. But sometimes it's worth it.
Yes.
Sometimes it's worth it to crash the network by adding resources to shorten the schedule and bring the project at completion beforehand. Okay, the strong point of earned value is the cost performance and the cost efficiency. The weak part is the schedule performance and the schedule efficiency rate. And we always recommend that when people are experiencing a negative schedule variance, they immediately look at the critical path to determine and focus their attention, management attention, on the critical path.
All right. Let's move on to step 10.
We've covered 1 through 9. 8 and 9 are unique to earned value. The other 8 are what we ought to be doing on all projects, in my opinion. Number 10 relates to number 1. Remember, number 1 said you have to define your project. Number 10 says you have to manage changes to the project. You can't be measuring earned value against a baseline that's obsolete. So the project manager ought to have enough clout, ought to be backed by management, so that he or she can say no to these brilliant ideas that come up. Yes, you can do this, or no, you are not to do this. You're not to incur costs. Not on my project. So number 10 says you have to manage changes to your defined project. Okay? Those are the 10 items. And I'm of the belief that, and I think it's unfair to call it simple earned value as much as it's robust, adequate, and it's a good place to start. There's no reason why we can't do all 10 of these steps on all projects.
Is it a good thing for a company to take this, let's continue to call it simple earned value, and start with that on their path towards using the full 32 criteria?
Yes, because they may never have to get to the 32 criteria.
When do you have to use?
I do a course for the University of California, Irvine, in earned value. It's a 20-hour course. We devote 4 hours to reading and analyzing ANSI Standard 748. So we discuss it and debate it. And the collective judgment is that there's a lot of redundancy there. ANSI Standard 748 asks for a number of things, including 4 of the 32 criteria deal with indirect cost management. Now, I don't know a project manager in the world that can do anything but track indirect costs. They have to track it for their own self-preservation, but they can't manage it. Their boss's boss have to manage indirect costs. And yet ANSI Standard 748 lays it upon the project manager to be responsible for the management of indirect costs, just as an example.
In conclusion, where would you say that earned value is heading?
I hope it's heading towards a universal application. I'm hoping that more and more project managers, as they get used to it, comfortable with it, understand what a cost performance index is, a cost performance efficiency factor. Think about it for a minute. I'm seeing managements accept presentations where the project manager will say, my cost performance index is 1.4. 1.4. That's 40% above perfect performance. That's called a miracle. It can't happen. And anytime management sees that, they ought to reject it. Perfect performance is 1.0. Perfect cost performance is 1.0. That's what we ought to be striving for.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time here. And thank you so much for coming to us and talking to us about earned value and simple earned value.
Okay, thank you.